if you use the kind of standard phraseology coming from environmental economics, there are basically two issues. There are market failure and policy failure, and biodiversity loss or loss of ecosystems and associated biodiversity resulting from that. Market failure, of course, this is a classical thing, theory of externalities. Why do externalities persist? Because they're elements of public goods, including for biodiversity. Elements of, that's important, it's not a pure public good, but some elements of biodiversity have features of public goods. And then you have the classical approach to, say, at least the simpler environmental problems, economic instruments like Pigouvian taxes, etc., etc., to internalize these externalities. Why would you, or why would we as a state, as a government, introduce some crude standards directly prescribing individual instead of introducing a smart environmental tax where everyone is optimizing at the margin? Why would we do that? Well, there might be, for instance, situations where the regulators, the guys who are going to be regulated by the state, they might be relatively homogeneous, right? Little difference between producers that kind of, say, pollute, for instance. So in that case, if they're pretty similar, then there will be no little gains from trade anyways. So why should we introduce a sophisticated, for instance, tradable permit scheme when a simple regulatory standard would also do? This is one of the aspects, what they call the economics of relatively simple tools. This in particular applies when you have many sources, tiny and mobile pollution sources. Wouldn't be really practical to have kind of tradable permit schemes or something like that for your exhaust fumes coming from your cars, right? Instead, you simply go ahead and prescribe specific standards, minimum standards for cars. Sometimes, of course, there is simply a need for what they call corner solutions here, right? Those of you who did environmental economics, you know that typically we assume these nice curvatures and then you have an inner optimum, right? But if we talk about, say, hazardous substances, it doesn't really make sense, right? We don't want to have, it wouldn't make sense to tax plutonium because we simply don't want it to be around in the environment. So in that sense, on that case, regulation would do better. And of course, there are kind of what I call technical issues here, and this is particularly interesting from a biodiversity perspective, because biodiversity is such a complex beast. As I said, it has aspects of public goods to it, has aspects of private goods to it, and it's typically non-homogeneous. So it's very difficult to tax biodiversity consumption or landscape consumption. It's possible to tax sulfur dioxide emissions, but for biodiversity, we have to come up with something more like smarter. So we don't have a tax base, unlike for homogeneous pollutants. And of course, we might, in many cases, again, not necessarily want to have an inner optimum. That's what's called non-convexities, right? Again, going back to the curvatures. Sometimes we need, in a sense, extreme solutions. One plot of land where nothing happens, where you have 100% conservation, and another plot of land with a fair distance in between, where a lot of things happen, a lot of economic activity with potential negative impacts. But the most interesting solution is actually to separate the two by way of spatial planning and by establishment of protected areas. And this is all going beyond the traditional realm of, say, thinking about environmental economics in terms of emissions taxation. But for biodiversity, that's a very important aspect.